Hey, sister students, today we're going to finish up the 1970s talking about two presidents, number 38 and 39, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So Ford becomes president, as you know, because President Nixon resigns over the Watergate scandal. And the interesting thing about Ford is that he was not elected as vice president or president. He was chosen as vice president when Spiro Agnew resigned, and then when Nixon resigned, he became president. One of his first acts, first things that he did as president was he pardoned Nixon. So the president has pardon power. They can pardon anyone for a crime. And so he pardoned Nixon for any crimes he committed or may have committed through the Watergate ordeal. And this was criticized across the nation because many Americans felt like Nixon should have to face justice just like any other American. But he was getting off the hook while a lot of other people were being convicted of crimes in the Watergate scandal. So the big thing that Ford is dealing with at home, just like Nixon, the economy, and stagflation. Stagflation is a term you need to remember. It's economic growth is going down and inflation is going up. High unemployment combined with inflation. And one reason for this is because of an organization called OPEC. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They're mainly Arab countries from the Middle East. And they used oil to try to get what they wanted, to control world politics as a political weapon. In 1973, they placed an embargo on the U.S., which means they did not sell oil to the U.S. because we sided with Israel in a war, a country they don't like. So oil was not being sold to the U.S. from OPEC, and this caused prices to skyrocket on oil. So the oil embargo ended, but OPEC kept rising their prices a little more, just so that they can help their own economies. The more money they make, the better off they are. So this has a huge impact on the American economy because we used oil for a lot of stuff, heating our homes, gasoline for cars, prices for food because you're having to transport food, grow food, etc., electricity. All these things are being affected, and it's causing inflation to occur. So stagflation, big domestic problem we're dealing with in the 1970s. As far as foreign policy, Nixon continued détente, which is the easing of tensions with the Soviets, remember? So we're easing tensions there. And then also 1975 are the Helsinki Accords. So this is Ford. He's attempting to calm relations between the Eastern Soviets and the Western European nations. It finally recognized boundaries of post-World War II boundaries, promised to respect human rights, and it was just a step forward of easing tensions between communist nations and democratic nations. All right, so we have another election in 1976. So Ford, he takes over for Carter in 74, but he's going to have to run in 76 to continue being president. So he runs, and the Democrats, they nominate Jimmy Carter to run against him. Now, many Americans are mad at Republicans. They're mad at Nixon, and they blame the Republicans for the Watergate scandal, the whole ordeal where they're losing faith in their government. They want someone new. And Carter is the perfect man to come in the 1976 election. He's the governor of Georgia. He's not in Washington, D.C. He's not seen as being a political insider. He's actually seen as being an outsider. So he's going to come in, clean up corruption. He's a moral guy. He's going to fix things in Washington. And so he defeats Carter in 1976. Here's our electoral map. You can see the South went Democratic. Most of the West went Republican. And Carter beats Ford, in 1976. So Carter becomes president, and here's his domestic policy items. So major issue they're dealing with in the 1970s is the economy. Just like Ford, just like Nixon. Oil prices continuing to rise, and that leads to a lot of other things because the U.S. is dependent on oil. Inflation is at 10%, so imagine prices being 10% higher at the end of the year than they were at the beginning of the year. Unemployment was high, so the economy's having issues. So Carter decides he's going to do several things. He's going to create the Department of Energy, try to figure out solutions to the energy crisis. What are we going to do with our oil crisis? And they created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which basically is going to create sites where we can keep reserve oil, so that if we ever are cut off completely, we'll have some reserves there that our country can still function. The main thing, our military, our big pieces that need oil will still have oil. And then to try to help stagflation, he's going to cut federal spending, try to reduce government a little bit, try to cut down the stagflation, try to help the economy, reduce inflation. He's going to clean up toxic dump sites. He's going to create the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we're worried about nuclear energy. We're going to try to solve those issues. And he's going to create a more diverse government. So he's going to appoint more women and minorities to government positions. Carter's also going to try to help the poor, help those living in inner cities. At the time in the 70s, many banks, they were not wanting to give loans to people who were living in low-income neighborhoods. And so they couldn't get a home loan, they couldn't get other banking services. And so basically, Carter creates the Community Reinvestment Act. And this requires that banks give credit to poor communities to try to prevent people from moving out of inner city neighborhoods, to try to keep inner city neighborhoods from being run down. And so he's trying to get banks to infuse money into these neighborhoods to try to help them stay solid, people stay in their homes, and rebuild these inner cities that are getting run down. A major issue of the Carter administration is what's known as 3 Mile Island. This is a nuclear power plant that was on 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. It had a partial meltdown, released nuclear toxins into the environment in 1979. So here's the nuclear reactors. The power plant had a partial meltdown, and nuclear waste was released into the air, into the environment. And so that's a big deal. And so Carter had to deal with that. They had to shut it down. And try to figure out why it happened, and now we're going to keep it from happening in the future. And this caused a lot of people to start being really against nuclear power. On the foreign policy side, Carter wanted the U.S. to set a moral example, he said, for the rest of the world. So we're going to make human rights a high priority. And so we're going to condemn apartheid, which is a segregation in South Africa. We're going to put pressure on the Soviet Union to allow Jews to leave their country, to move to Israel or to the United States. And we're going to not help dictators. We're going to cut off any aid to their countries if they're violating human rights. Carter also wanted to deal fairly with Panama. And so if you remember back to the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt getting the Panama Canal built and the U.S. controlling that zone. Well, Carter made the Panama Canal Treaty with Panama that gave Panama back control of the Panama Canal zone. They turned it over completely in the year 1999, so it was kind of a transition period from the 70s through 1999. And in 1999, Panama now controls their canal. Okay, Camp David Accords. This was a big policy win for the Carter administration. It involves Israel. So as you may know, Israel was created as a homeland for the Jewish people in 1948 after World War II. And since then, the U.S. has always generally supported Israel because it's a pro-Western democracy and it's in the Middle East where there's not many democracies. And so the U.S. is supporting Israel. Now, Egypt and Israel, they fought several wars against each other since Israel was created. And in 1977, Carter invites Anwar Sadat, who's the president of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, who's the prime minister of Israel. So it's these two guys right here, and here's Carter in the middle. And he brought the leaders together to the presidential retreat in Camp David in Maryland. And he worked with them to try to reach an agreement that was called the Camp David Accords. So basically what the Camp David Accords says is that Israel is going to return the Sinai Peninsula, which is a section of Egypt that Israel had taken at some point during a war. And then Egypt offered a peace treaty and to open up diplomatic relations with them. And so basically it's peace for the Israelis to give back the Sinai Peninsula. So Sadat and Begin, they were given the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts, but many other Arab nations were not happy with Sadat making peace with Israel, and they cut off relations with Egypt. And he was later assassinated by some Muslim fundamentalists who opposed peace with Israel. And so it was a big policy win for peace in the Middle East, but a lot of people in the Middle East did not like it, and Sadat paid with his life. All right, our last major foreign policy issue that Carter had to deal with was the Iranian Revolution and the Iranian hostage crisis. Now, how this started was the ruler of Iran, the Shah, he was an ally of the United States. He was actually put in power by Western governments in the 50s. He was a dictator, and he didn't treat his people very well. And so in 1978, there was demonstrations against the Shah, against the leader. They're trying to throw him out, overthrow the country. He fled in 1979, and Ayatollah Khomeini and other religious leaders, they took over control. They took over the power in Iran, and they put in a new Islamic law, Shiite Islamic law. This new law was anti-West. They resented America for putting the Shah in place in the 50s and his brutal tactics. And so the Shah flees to the United States for medical treatment. He has cancer. He flees in 1979. Now the Iranians are angry, and they want the Shah to be returned back to Iran so he can face punishment for his crimes against the people. And so there's these Iranian students that are outside the U.S. Embassy in the capital of Tehran, and they seize and storm the embassy, and they take the Americans inside the embassy as captives, and they hold them hostage for more than a year. Now, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions on Iran, but they weren't able to get them released very quickly. America's image suffered because the United States tried to free the hostages with military. There was a helicopter raid that failed, and ultimately the hostages were released on Carter's last day as president, as the new president, Ronald Reagan, was being sworn in. So they held them until Carter was out of power and then released them. All right, here is Carter's kind of presidency summed up between foreign policy and domestic policy. If you want to take a look here, kind of sorts it out for you a little bit.